Hey guys, how you doing? It's Philip Wong here and I'm at the AFANS conference for 2016, and if you don't know what AFANS stands for, it is the Accounting and Finance Association of Australia and New Zealand. It's basically the main conference for accounting and finance research, and it's some pretty heavy and some pretty interesting stuff. I'm really glad to be here. Now specifically I'd like to say hello to Quinn, who asked me a question on Facebook which says, "Hi Philip, could you please help me with this question? What historical factors help lead to the development of present-day accounting practice?" Wow, you have no idea what a big question you have just asked. So pretty much whenever I look at accounting, all I can see is worlds and layers of history. There are entire journals dedicated to researching the history of accounting, and it's pretty interesting stuff. And by no means is it small or trivial. In fact, whenever we find archaeological evidence of ancient civilizations, one of the first things which we're always able to figure out isn't the language, isn't the religion. Usually it's the civilization's level of mathematics, and almost always in the form of accounting. Sure, plenty of cultures don't have the concept of zero, and certainly not all of them have the concept of negative numbers, but numbers are pretty consistent, particularly when you're counting whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, 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 blah. So usually we figure out the number system long before we ever figure out the language system, and usually when we figure out what these things say, they say things such as, "I exchange you 2 bushels of wheat for 3 goats." You see, the one thing that humans love to write down is who owes people what. Some of the earliest systems of accounting we've ever found uses rope with little knots on it to signify certain things such as resources or slaves or something else that we have available. You have to remember that the word accounting derives from this idea of accountability, and wherever humans have had things that are worth trading, there's always some form of accountability. What have you done with my stuff? Where's my money? In fact, even the word auditing oozes with history. One of the things the Romans were really good at was conquering nations, but they wouldn't always kick out the administrators. Oftentimes they would leave the administrators in place and the Roman army would go on and conquer the next land. However, once every 2 or 3 years, when the Roman Empire would return, they would want to find out what that administrator has been up to. Now, while most of the educated class could actually speak Latin, not all of them could write Latin. You know, what with the no Twitter and no email situation in ancient Rome. So when the Roman Empire returned, they would often hold this accountability session orally. Think about it. Orally, an oral account of what is happening, otherwise known as an audit. Even the word debit and credit ooze history. Think about it. How do you spell credit? And you just simply shorten that down to CR. And the word debit, DEBIT, shortened down to DR, because of course there's an R in debit, right? No, not in the slightest. So where did this R come from in debit? Again, it's Latin. The original terms that were used by Luca Pacioli were debere and credere. The word debere means an obligation, or things that you are responsible for looking after. Specifically here we're talking about the assets. Somebody gave you those assets and you're obliged to try and look after them and not waste them. Credere, on the other side, is all about credence or belief. And think about the balance sheet. Who believed in you to give you these assets in the first place? Well, the bank believes that they're going to get their money back. And indeed, the proprietors invested their belief so that they can make profits. Debere, credere. Medieval terms that we still use today. And you might say, sure, no one's ever come up with a better system other than debits and credits. Otherwise, we'd be using some other system, triple entry accounting, debits, credits, and shebits, maybe. But that simply isn't true. In fact, there is a much better model. It's called the REA model of accounting, or resources, events, and agents. It's a single entry system, and you may have learned about it in accounting information systems. REA completely reconceptualizes this idea of accountability that was imagined by Pacioli and the Venetian bankers back 500 years ago. And indeed, REA is much better for computer systems and SQL servers that we have today. So why the hell do we still use it? Basically history and inertia. We've always used it. Doesn't necessarily have to make sense, but it's good enough to do the job. And so accounting has just evolved that way. You know, even the concept of depreciation reflects the history in which it was invented. Depreciation first started to appear when people were accounting for railroads. Railroads are not particularly cheap. They require years of investment, and the payback is very, very long. And despite that upfront capital, you've got some idea about how long you're going to be using these assets for. But seriously, the only reason why we have depreciation today is because of trains. Okay, what about the concept of cost accounting? Well, that was invented by a guy named Wedgwood. If that sounds familiar, go to your grandmother's shelves and see if she's got any fine china. Turn that plate over and you might find a Wedgwood logo. Yep, the same guy that's famous for making dinnerware is also the same guy who was trying to keep his costs down, and hence cost accounting. What about something such as fair value? How has that got anything to do with history? Simple answer, the Germans. You see, after World War I, Germany suffered a period of hyperinflation, and these miserable circumstances were some of the impetus for World War II. You can find pictures of people in that time wheeling wheelbarrows full of money. And while it looks like they're rich, that was just a day's worth of labour. Inflation rates were at the 1,000% mark, to the point where money just didn't make any sense anymore. And certainly this is a big problem for accounting, because if you can't trust the numbers because you can't trust the currency, well then what the hell's the point of counting anything at all? Okay, so today we don't have hyperinflation in Australia. We've got like this measly 2% inflation rate or something like that. However, we still have all the problems that inflation brings. If you want to find out more about the problems with additivity, go and watch my historical cost video right here. Or of course you can find the link to that in the description below. But put simply, after the Second World War, people started to ask themselves, well, if inflation is bad and historical cost assumes that inflation is zero, then maybe historical cost is not so good, and maybe we need to do something about it. Hence, mark-to-market systems were born, either in the form of entry price accounting or exit price accounting. But again, these things were invented to meet the historical demands at the time. So today's practice of marking financial instruments to the market and the standards that those entail simply reflect the history of where historical cost was inadequate. What about the accounting standards or the framework? Well, if you look at the way the framework or indeed any accounting standards are drawn, you pretty much figure out that it's a very, very political process. These guys had power or those guys had power, but in any case, we don't always necessarily get the standards that we need. If you just want to find out how crazy standard setting can get, go and have a look at all the fights over measurement. And there's an argument that regulation is just a response to the various crises that occurred at any one time. I mean, the reason why we have the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in America is because, well, Enron, the Basel and Dodd-Frank Acts are a direct response to the global financial crisis. Here in Australia, we have the 2 strikes rule for corporate governance. And again, that was Kevin Rudd's response to the global financial crisis and the fact that CEOs were seen to be paying themselves too much money despite the fact that their firms were not performing. And the conceptual framework and most standards are not any different. They're all responses to some particular problem at the time. So it's really not hard to see how the practice is very much driven by the history of how things were. And if you're still not convinced that history does in fact impact upon what we do today, think about this. If I was to reinvent accounting, I would get rid of debits and credits, but I would still keep double entry. And you might ask yourself, well, how the hell does that make any sense? Simple. I would use positive numbers for debits and negative numbers for credits, and if you add everything together, you would always come back to zero. And you might think to yourself, well, why didn't Luca Pacioli invent it like that in the first place? I mean, he just could have done that 500 years ago. But it reflects the history of what was going on at the time. 500 years ago, people didn't understand what negative numbers were. It just wasn't an invented concept, and certainly not one that was understood by the common man. And yes, most of the traders back then, 500 years ago in Venice, were men. So if you don't understand negative numbers, how do you get around this idea of I have something or I owe you something? Well, it's pretty easy. They split it up into these 2 ideas. Debere, obligations that you have to look after, and credere, your obligations to other people who put their belief into you. And yet even still, I think it would be much better if we got rid of debits and credits and just used positive numbers and negative numbers. It would certainly be much easier in Excel, but we don't do it because of history. Thanks very much, Queen, for this question. These are all ideas that have just popped into my head at the time. I haven't written a script for this particular video, but what I'm trying to prove to you is that you have asked an extremely large question. There are entire journals on this. There are academics who have devoted their lives to the history of accounting. This is not something I can sum up in a 10-minute video. But if there's one thing I want you to take away from this video, and that is accounting history is damn interesting stuff. There are entire stories that can be told here, and accounting makes a lot more sense if you know the stories about the way it evolved. Always interesting to ask ourselves, well, if I was placed in that position, what would I do differently? Because accounting is not set in stone. It's not a law of nature. It's something that we all agree on. If you can think of a better way and you can articulate that to other people, you might be the one to change the course of history. Thanks for the question, Quian. Happy studies.